Chapter 11, The West African Coast, the Noc Civilization. In central Nigeria, a hitherto unsuspected culture bloomed between 1000 BC and 1000 AD. Tin mining operations conducted in 1928 brought this civilization out into the open. Lieutenant Colonel J. Dent Young, an Englishman, led mining operations in the Nigerian village of Noc, located in the Jos region. During these operations, one of the miners found a small terracotta of a monkey head. Other finds included a terracotta human head and a foot. The colonel, at a later date, had these artifacts placed in a museum in Jos. In 1942, another artifact, clearly belonging to the same culture, was found, but this time in Gemma, some distance away. This find was brought to the attention of Bernard Fagg, an English cadet administrative officer. Mr. Fagg had a background as an archaeologist, and by the mid-40s he wrote on this and other finds in the region. The ancient culture was now called the Noc Civilization, named after the village in which the small terracotta monkey head was discovered. Since then, around 400 pieces of Noc art have been recovered. Their peculiar style and fine finish characterize them. Contradictory dates for this Noc artifacts do appear in the literature, but Moore and Langevin, two modern scholars, declare that after calibration the period of Noc art spans from 1000 BC until 300 BC. The site itself is much older than this, however. This is evidence of human occupation as early as 4580 to 4290 BC. For the birth of a civilization in the region, however, more conservative dates have been suggested. Moore and Langevin believe that their dating of the art pieces indicate that the entire chronology of some civilizations from West Africa need to be revised. These cultures may have begun earlier, at the beginning of the 3rd millennium before Christ. The view that the Noc civilization had its genesis around 3000 BC more than supports an earlier reflection made by Professor Igbo Civilization, the former head of the Nigerian Museums Network. He noted that the sculptures are so advanced that they must have had time to evolve. The question must be left open so that people will know there is a possibility Noc might be much older than is generally accepted today. The artifacts are mostly human statues made of terracotta. From a few inches in height to almost life-size, they depict people wearing rows of bracelets, necklaces, skull caps, and, at least one instance, a cape. Most show their hair exposed. The coiffures are inventive and bold with highly individual plaits, ridges, locks, and buns. Mr. Fagg wrote that the Noc people must have taken just as many hours as the chic Lagos ladies of the 20th century do arranging their coiffures or to put them into their own historical period. The Mediterranean ladies who were living in their villas north of the Sahara. The sculptors experimented with geometric shapes. Some of the heads are conical, but others are spherical and cylindrical. There are statues of elephants, monkeys, ticks, and snakes, as well as human-animal combinations. There is a statue of a man amalgamated with a bird and also a statue of a sphinx. Moreover, there are statues of humans dominating wild animals showing their power over nature, or possibly over their own animal instincts. These may represent priests. Of the clothing depicted in the art were penis sheaths. Bernard de Grun, an authority on Noc, adds that, without being diffusionist, one can notice the following facts concerning the antiquity and distribution of penis sheaths in Africa. The earliest representations of this type of clothing appear on proto- and pre-dynastic Egyptian figures, around 3000 BC. A famous example is the MacGregor statuette from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, dated to 3100 BC. This type of Egyptian penis sheath, called Bantu sheaths, is a specialized literature appeared to be Libyan in origin, probably from the Paleonegritic culture substratum. The Noc people wore heavy collars made of stone beads. In their ears, noses, and lips, they wore quartz cylinders. Important personages wore cotton clothes, whilst others wore small aprons of leather, bark cloth, beads, or basketwork ornaments over the pubis. It is likely they also indulged in body decoration and used elaborate ornaments. Some of the statues are almost life-size, being 4 or more feet in height. They show the oldest known examples of African proportion, an aesthetic where the statue's head is 1/4 or 1/3 the size of the body. Bernard de Grun, mentioned earlier, suggests that this should be called the Noc canon. Professor Frank Willett, a very distinguished writer on Nigerian art, comments that making such large terracotta figures is a very unusual skill. The sculptors were able to fire them successfully, an extremely difficult task in an uncontrolled open fire. They took great care to keep the thickness of the sculpture even. Elsewhere, he adds that the high degree of artistic skill of the sculpture suggests that the artist could have made naturalistic sculptures if they wished. Indeed, some of the animal sculptures represent their subject matter in a fairly realistic way. Dr. Io, cited earlier, suspected that the commonality of style represented by the artifacts and their wide distribution may suggest that the Noc people lived in a hierarchically structured society that was probably ruled by a class of noblemen, where there was a division of labor, iron workers, farmers, and so on, rich enough to support full-time artists. Certain people must have stood out as eminent members of the community, and their existence and role were recorded by the artists who served under them. This idea of a stratified society is developed by de Grun, who adds that the Noc statues are clearly images of dignitaries, kings, queens, priests, diviners. These images are surely worshipped in sacred shrines. De Grun, author of The Birth of Art in Black Africa, speculates that the shrines may have been domed, thatched buildings built on a square base. Inside these buildings were seated and standing Noc statues on the side walls, surrounding a central altar, hypothetically with statues of a king, queen, or other important cultural heroes. The Noc civilization was built on an agricultural basis. Grindstones have been found in Noc deposits that were used to pound grain. Among the statues are two clay figures, each depicting a farmer carrying a tool, possibly an axe or a hoe slung over the shoulder. Oil-bearing seeds called Athen have also been found among the deposits. This suggests that the Noc farmers cultivated these plants to extract oil from them. They are also thought to have cultivated yams and millet. A statue of an individual wearing a patterned cape indicates the existence of textile making of some skill. Mrs. Uyuba, a Nigerian authority on textiles, wrote that from this early time, the weaving of a cotton on vertical looms probably existed, but the use of cloth was limited to a very few. Other evidence suggests that there was an iron smelting industry, one of the earliest in that part of the world. Professor Fred Anozie, former head of the University of Nigeria's archaeological department, noted that as far back as at least 500 BC, metal technology was already known. Among the artifacts found at Noc were smelting tuyere, pieces of furnace wall, and iron slag. At Taruga, another site associated with Noc culture, the finds included objects made from raw iron, some slag, some tuyere fragments, pottery, terracotta fragments, and so on. The most interesting find consists of several concentrations of iron slag, many of which contain the structure of the furnaces in their original positions. Professor Io suspects that iron might have played an important part in the building of the kingdom. It would have given military and agricultural advantages to those familiar with iron, allowing them to dominate those without the technology. He asks, could the uniformity of the Noc art tradition have been brought about, at least in part, by the sudden use of iron among a group of people within the area of the art? Such a people would first have improved their agriculture and weapons, which would have enabled them to exercise considerable influence, such as exemplified by the art, over a wide area. The contact between the various groups might have been a mere interaction, but it could have also been common allegiance to one god or king. In answer to the professor, we feel that the dates given for the use of iron, 500 BC, are perhaps too late to account for the birth of the culture with widely distributed artifacts that date from 1000 BC. In support of the professor, however, there is a controversial evidence that Noc metallurgy may indeed predate 1000 BC. Dr. Anozie was thus conservative in his dates. Dr. Charles Finch, the distinguished African-American authority, informs us that more recent work by C.A. Diop suggests that African iron smelting at an early date was not confined to the Nile Valley. At the Noc sites in Nigeria, Iron slag is present, and several bits of charcoal found at the site have been dated, respectively at 3500 BC, 2000 BC, and 900 BC. However, with understandable caution, Diop hesitated to affirm straight out that the iron smelting, let alone steelmaking, in West Africa could be attested back to the 4th millennium BC. Though he did point out that no other valid explanation has yet been forthcoming. Moreover, diggings near Kaolack, Senegal, revealed the presence of copper and iron tools with associated charcoal debris dated back to 2800 BC by 2 separate laboratories. There are distinguishing features of the Noc style. The eyes are often depicted as triangular. In other pieces, the lower lid of the eye form a circle together with the eyelids. The nostrils, lips, pupils, and ears are usually pierced through with a hole. Finally, the hair and bracelets are depicted with unusual care and attention. Bernard de Grun believes that it is possible to distinguish 5 styles of Noc art. These were the Gemma style, the Kuchmafa style, the Katsina Ala style, and 2 peripheral styles that may have suggested 2 new and separate civilizations, the Sokoto style and the Katsina style. If these peripheral styles were indeed separate from the Noc civilization, then the Sokoto culture has been tentatively dated to 200 BC to 200 AD. Similar dates have been given to the Katsina culture. Igbo Civilization. In 1938, another unsuspected culture was discovered, this time in Onitsha province of eastern Nigeria. This culture has since been called the Igbo Ukwu, named after the village from which the artifacts were first encountered. Isaiah Nosey, a Nigerian gentleman, stumbled across the treasures quite by accident. At the time, he was digging a cistern to collect rainwater in his backyard. 2 feet below ground, he encountered a series of finely wrought bronze pieces. Subsequently, more bronzes were found by excavating the compounds of his brothers, Richard Nosey and Jonah Nosey. These objects recovered were astonishing. As one writer put it, their superb workmanship and 1,000-year-old patina, with its green and purple luster, are a wonder to behold. Radiocarbon dating for the finds established dates of the 9th and 10th centuries AD. The artifacts were made of copper and leaded bronze, which is an alloy of copper, tin, and lead. They demonstrated geometric exactitude and perfection of form. The archaeologists were reduced in incoherent mumbling. Primitive peoples do not produce metalwork of anything like this quality. One such scholar, Mr. Peter Garlake, admitted that Igbo Ukwu is probably the most enigmatic prehistoric site in Africa. It represents an almost unparalleled concentration of wealth. In bronze and beads, in the hands of one man, it is part of a sophisticated and idiosyncratic tradition of craftsmanship and art that must have had a long history of development and is otherwise completely unknown. Yet the present weight of the evidence indicates that it belongs to a period where the savannah states were still young. This is well before one would expect a concentration of power to have developed in the forest polities. At present, Igbo Ukwu makes no economic sense. Among the finds were fine copper chains, wristlets, profusely elaborate staff ornaments, some decorated by colored beads, vessels brilliantly cast in the shape of seashells, drinking cups, pots, sword scabbards, a copper altar stand, pendants, and also fly whisks, a traditional symbol held by a person with authority. The handle of the fly whisk depicts a horseman with his headdress, pouch, and belt. Horses must have been utilized at the time as a means of transport. One authority speculates that the horseman may have been a titled personage, given the rarity of the horses in the region and the need to import them. Dr. Charles Finch writes that several of the objects convey artistically the impression of having lain at the bottom of the sea for eons of time collecting barnacles, corals, and other assorted marine life. This was, in effect, deliberately created by the caster. The quality of the metalwork was such that one scholar, Professor Willett, commented that one can only suppose that the smiths of Igbo Ukwu enjoyed demonstrating their virtuosity. The same writer comments that the outstanding feature of the treasures is the great elaboration of the surface decoration. The objects have encrusted appearance. Most conspicuous are the number of small animals, especially insects, which stand out from the surface. Tiny spirals are also commonly employed. Even repairs to the faults in the castings were made in the form of spirals. Other decorations were formed of a long, fine threads, which may be run in straight lines or used to outline other shapes, particularly rectangles or lozenges, or to form networks of various types, either triangular or curvilinear. Historians and archaeologists have attempted to grapple with the significance of these finds. Such a concentration of wealth as the metalwork and the beads represent, says Professor Willett, has been thought to imply some sort of centralized government unlike the stateless societies that characterized Igbo land at the time of the first European contacts. Some of the objects, especially those excavated at Richard and Nosey's compound, were associated with the ritual burial of an important and probably titled personage. This is unusual because Igbo society was supposed to have been one that did without kings. The site of Igbo Richard, says Professor Ayo, yielded much information about Igbo culture, its priest-king institution, and its burial custom. Here, the tomb of a priest-king, lined possibly with carved wooden panels, was uncovered. The body of the inmate is believed to have been clothed in ceremonial regalia and sat on a stool with the two hands supported by copper brackets. The corpse wore a breastplate, copper anklets, and strings of beads, a beaded headdress, a bronze crown. In front of him, a bronze leopard skull on a copper rod was struck into the ground. The arrangement was then covered, first with the wooden panels and then with the earth. Also found in his tomb were 3 tusks of ivory, iron goods, and pottery. The important personage is now thought to have been a priest-king or Eziniri. Many scholars believe that the copper and bronze artifacts were made exclusively for the household of this title holder. The Igbo Ukwu region, however, is lacking in copper. Various scholars have thus theorized the trans-Saharan trade caravans brought the copper in from the north. It is thought that the Igbo sold ivory, pepper, kola nuts, and spices north to the Saharan states. Horses could well have been used to conduct this trade. Interestingly, well-preserved fabrics were found with the objects, and this indicates the existence of an Igbo textile industry. It is, however, possible that the source of the copper was the Congo region. As Professor Ayo explains, perhaps the forest zone between Nigeria and the Congo, where copper is found in the Katanga district, was no barrier to the importation of copper into Nigeria. The Igbos are generally thought to have been the earliest workers of copper and its alloys in the medieval West Africa by smithing. Their castings, by contrast, were of leaded bronze and show complete mastery of the lost wax technique. Professor Fred Enosi explained this technique of manufacturing metal goods as follows. 1. The first step is to obtain some plastic wax, which could be beeswax. The object to be cast was formed with the wax, inserting all the details and decorations. If, for example, a snake was to be cast, the model in wax should have the tail, the head, the eyes, and the natural decorations of the snake. 2. The model of the snake in wax is then covered with clay, leaving 2 openings, A and B. This became a mold with the model of the snake in wax. 3. The mold was tilted a little and heated. The wax melted and flowed out through the lower hole, B. As nature does not follow for a vacuum, air goes in through the hole, A, to take the space created by the wax lost through the hole, B. 4. The casting metal, which could be copper or trash, was cut into little pieces, put into the crucible, and heated in the hearth. 5. As soon as the metal melted, it was poured into the mold through the hole, A, while the air in the mold was expelled through hole, B, by the metal. 6. Both the mold and its content were allowed to get cold and the mold broken to bring out the copper or brass snake. This technique, also called Tsare Perdue, was later used by other Nigerian peoples in the manufacture of their art and crafts, and is thus a legacy of the Igbo achievement. In closing, David Northrup penned a good summary of the Igbo Ukwu finds and the industry and trade links implied by them. Recent excavations have unearthed a spectacularly rich material culture dating from 9th century AD. The Igbo Ukwu finds showed evidence of metalworking, weaving, and pottery making of unusual skill. The metalwork included 110 major and 575 minor copper and bronze objects of very high quality and very distinctive design. The textiles of two types were found at Igbo Ukwu, one of grass or leaf fibers in a previously unknown weave pattern, the other a kind of cloth remarkably similar to cotton. Both were of a high quality. In addition, over 20,000 pieces of pottery were recovered. Also recovered were 165,000 beads of Indian manufacture, with some perhaps from Venice. Yoruba Civilization. By the 11th century AD, the Yoruba, ruling from the city of Ife, were the leading cultural force in southern Nigeria. Their civilization has been widely admired by many scholars. Professor Sheikh Anta Diop, for example, wrote that it is impossible to describe here all the riches of the civilizations of Ife. Herbert Wendt, a German science writer, was much more flattering. Modern ethnologists, says Wendt, have found the art of the Yorubas so astonishingly high in quality that they did not, at first, ascribe it to a Negro race. It was Leo Frobenius who first ranked the culture of the Yorubas with that of the Mediterranean. The Yoruba Empire consisted of city-states similar to those of ancient Greece. Some of these states had 150 to 250,000 inhabitants. Art objects of the highest quality were found in their ruins. Glazed urns, tiles with pictures of animals and gods on them, bronze implements, gigantic granite figures. The Yorubas introduced the cultivation of yams, the preparation of cheese, and the breeding of horses into West Africa. They had outstanding artists in metal, gold casters, cotton weavers, wood carvers, and potters. Their professions formed themselves into guilds with their own laws. Their children were brought up in the educational camps. Their public affairs were directed by a courtly aristocracy and exuberantly expanding bureaucracy. Professor Leo Frobenius, a German scholar, was the pioneering authority on the Yoruba civilization. When he first encountered this culture in the early 20th century, he felt he had discovered remnants of the lost Greek civilization of Atlantis. Unearthing beautiful statuary and old palaces, he heard among the Yoruba legends describing these ancient times. One such story alludes to an ancient royal metropolis with a palace of gold walls that had sunk beneath the waters of the Atlantic. In addition, Frobenius identified Ulukan, the Yoruba sea god, with Poseidon, the ancient Greek deity. While this analysis is all clearly in error, Mr. Garlake explains why Frobenius could be forgiven for making these blunders. The calm repose and realism of the Yoruba sculptures were reminiscent of classical Greece. The pantheon of Yoruba gods, their attributes, their vivid lives and complex responsibilities echoed Mount Olympus. The architecture of the houses and palaces were rooms opened off enclosed courtyards open to the sky, resembled the impluvia of early Mediterranean, particularly Etruscan, i.e. Roman buildings. The Yoruba concept of the universe, their educational system, the organization of their society, and their statecraft supported a Greek connection. Ile-Ife was the ancient capital city of Yorubas, also known simply as Ife. Archaeological excavations show that the site was inhabited by 600 AD. Among its first residents were farmers who cultivated yams and oil palms. It also clear, wrote Africanists Oliver and Fagan, that from the earliest times the town had import iron industry and also that it engaged in the manufacture of glass. According to William Fagg, an important authority, excavations of the Ulukan Grove site revealed colored beads and also glass in beautiful shades of deep red and blue, turquoise, and several shades of green. Professor Willett adds that here evidently had been the center of the great glass-making industry, which had spread blue glass segi beads across West Africa. Ile became a powerful city sometime after 1000 AD, home to the divine ruler, the Oni. It was also the center of trade routes. The Yoruba imported horses, salt, copper, and brass from the Saharan states paid for by the exports of large crops of kola nuts and also cloth. Textiles were an important industry in the mid-19th century. William Clark, an English visitor, remarked that, as good as an article of cloth can be woven by the Yoruba weavers as by any people, in durability their cloths far excel the prints and homespuns of Manchester. But how far back in time does the industry go? Does it go back to the period under discussion? Mrs. Yuba, a textiles expert in University of Ife, explains that by the time of the ancient Ifes, weaving on the vertical loom was more extensive in the cotton-growing areas. From the bronzes, i.e. art pieces of Ife and Benin, we may picture a basic style of dress which makes use of a draped cloths of various lengths, although even in earlier times the use of sewn garments was not unknown. Everywhere in Nigeria, weaving had reached a highly advanced stage by at least at the end of the 14th century. Cotton was the yarn most frequently used. A silk yarn, called anef, was still in use by the Yoruba to produce a cloth called sanyan, and was perhaps also used by the Hausa, who today use the same silk, to embroider costly robes. At the center of Ife stood the Athen, which is a walled royal palace. It has been excavated, but little detail has been gleaned about the form of the medieval palace. Despite this, Professor Frobenius learned enough to conclude that it was a structure built of authentic enameled bricks, decorated with artistic porcelain tiles and all sorts of ornaments. Ile-Ife itself was walled and also paved. Excavations show that its walls were built in two concentric circles. As the population grew, or the direct influence exerted by the Oni increased, new walls were taken under royal protection. Professor Ekpo Iyo narrates a curious oral tradition concerning Oni Uluwo, a distinguished Yoruba ruler. Apparently, she was walking around the capital when her regalia got splashed with mud. Uluwo was so upset by this that she ordered the construction of pavements for all the public and religious places in the city. Archaeology confirms that pavements are widespread in Africa. Potsherd pavements are the most common types of pavements known in the West Africa. The most consistent reports about excavated pavements in West Africa have so far come from Ife, specifically the sites at Uduwa College, Lafogido, Itayumo, Obalara's land, and Wo Asiri land. The pavements embellished the courtyards and often had altars built at the ends against walls. Peter Garlick adds that many of the pavements had regular and geometric patterns, often emphasized by the incorporation of white quartz pebbles in their surface. Such pavements have been found on prehistoric sites from Chad in the northeast to Togo in the west. As early as 1913, Dr. Frobenius speculated that there was a link between the Yoruba culture and the cultures of ancient America. He believed that this connection was forged at a date well before Christopher Columbus's so-called discovery of America. I cannot finish, wrote Frobenius, without devoting a word or two to the certain symptomatic conformity of Western Atlantic civilization with its higher manifestations in America. Its cognate features are so striking that they cannot be overlooked, and as the region of Atlantic African culture is Yoruba, it seems to be present question whether it might not be possible to bring the marvelous Maya monuments into some prehistoric connection with those of Yoruba. Strangely enough, recent archaeological evidence lends support to some of the Frobenius's ideas. Scholars have discussed the validity of many pieces of evidence for ancient connections between Africa and America. Dr. David Kelly is one of such example. In his own words, the kind of evidence field archaeologists like is the pavement of Ile-Ife, a former Yoruba capital, Van Sertima, 1976, 264 to 267. This is made from broken potsherd that were decorated by rolling corn cobs over their surface before firing. Paul Mangelsdorf, who had seen some of the sherds, assured me about 1954 that they were indeed Zea maize, i.e., the American plant. Another interpretation of Yoruba tradition is that the capital was moved from Ile-Ife to Old Oyo about AD 1100 or earlier. M.D.W. Jeffries, 1953. If so, this site provides the hard evidence that archaeologists want for American plants in Africa in pre-Columbian times, i.e. before Columbus. No one knows whether Native Americans sailed across the Atlantic and visited Ile-Ife, bringing the maize with them. It is equally possible that Yorubas visited ancient America and returned with the maize. One thing is certain. Contact between the two cultures occurred before 1100 AD or before whatever date is accepted for the paving of the city. Scholars today routinely speak of the pre-pavement period as between 800 to 1000 AD, and of the post-pavement period as after 1000 AD. On this basis, contact between the two cultures, Yoruba and Native American, must therefore have taken place before 1000 AD. According to the Reverend Samuel Johnson, himself a Yoruba and a pioneering Yoruba scholar, Ile-Ife had important sculptures, commonly known as the Ife marbles, several of which may be seen in Ile-Ife to this day, i.e. 1921, said to be the handiwork of early ancestors of the race. They are altogether Egyptian in form. The most notable of them is what is known as the Opa Iranian staff, an obelisk standing on the site of Iranian's supposed grave, having characters cut into it. 3 or 4 of these sculptures may now be seen in the Egyptian court of the British Museum, showing at a glance that they are among the kindred works of art. The Ife marbles are monoliths that date back before 800 AD. Of granite and iron, they range from 1 to 18 feet in height and are associated with Ogun, the deity of iron. The Reverend Johnson believes that the written characters on Opa Iranian, the largest monument, suggest a Phoenician origin. This raises all sorts of questions. Did the Yorubas have a script? Is this Reverend Johnson correct in saying that the script shows affinities to Phoenician? What happened to these British Museum exhibits since 1921? One of the great achievements of the Yoruba is their urban culture. They had villages, hamlets, and small market towns. By the year AD 1300, says a modern scholar, the Yoruba people also built numerous walled cities surrounded by farms. The other cities were Uwu, Oyo, Ijbu, Ijesa, Kitu, Popo, Igba, Sabe, Dasa, Igbado, Igbomnia, the 16 Ikiti principalities, Owo, and Ondo. The ruling dynasties of most, if not all, of these cities trace their origins to Ile-Ife. Supporting the populations of these city-states was agriculture. Practicing crop rotation, the Yoruba in the pre-pavement periods, as we have seen, cultivated local crops of yam and oil palm. Originally Native American in origin, they cultivated maize. In later periods, they grew potato, cotton, holcus, sorghum, rice, cassava, melon, beans, groundnut, sugarcane, orange, okra, and various vegetables. This was in addition to yam, cocoa yam, oil palm, cola, and maize. The Uwu city-state was the oldest daughter of Eve, founded in the grassland area north of modern Oral Uwu. Oni Asunkungbada ruled as its first king. This state became a great military power in the region. Utilization of cavalry forces led to its early importance. In addition, Uwu exercised hegemony over both Oyo and Igbomnia in their earlier years. Dynasts from Uwu founded the cities of Uwu Ogber and Uwu Ipo. Not long after Oyo became a great city, it came to dominate the trade caravans. There were 2 such caravan routes that linked Yoruba land with the outside world. The first traversed the region in north to the southwest direction, passing through Hausaland. It linked the Yorubas at Oyo to the trans-Saharan trade. From Oyo, it passed the Kisi, Saki, Isan, etc., ultimately reaching the coast at Ajesi, the modern Porto Novo. The second caravan route traversed in the region in a north to southeast direction. Again, it centered in Oyo, but this time it passed through Ilesa, Ikitililand, Owo, the Kingdom of Benin, where it eventually reached the coast. Feeder routes linked these caravans from all directions within the Yoruba territories. Goods moved by head portage of sometimes by the use of ferries if the routes crossed rivers. Nominal tolls were imposed on the movement of goods. The Athen Ie Palace at Oyo, over many generations, evolved into a great walled complex that enclosed buildings, courtyards, and large areas of forest land. Susan Denyer, an architectural authority, suggests that it may well have had over 100 courtyards, each of an astonishing size, being far larger than a private house. One of them was as large as 2 football pitches. Each courtyard was used for a special function, such as public assemblies, dancing at festivals, or for the Oba's private use. Denyer further suggests that the courtyards may well have been paved with quartz pebbles and potsherds. When Captain Clapperton, the English traveler, visited in the 1820s, he reported that the palace complex covered an area of 260 hectares. Ilif continued to exercise cultural and religious influence over the other walled cities, such as Owo. This religious influence, wrote Dr. Davidson, was reflected by the beauty and excellence of Yoruba sculpture in wood and brass, clay and ivory. If has yielded many splendid things that were made long ago in honor of the Yoruba beliefs and rulers. Yoruba artists were called on to celebrate the Oni of If and his kinsmen, and evolved one of the greatest schools of sculpture the world has known. The art, much of its metal, was of the great distinction. Dr. Finch tells us that such was the genius of the Eve metallurgical artists that nothing in the Renaissance surpassed their technique. Professor Willett agrees. He feels that Yoruba art would stand comparison with anything which ancient Egypt, classical Greece and Rome, or Renaissance Europe had to offer. The development of Yoruba art is something of a puzzle, explains the historian Werner Gillen, because the splendid artifacts found have all been masterpieces, and no traces of early beginnings by less accomplished artists have ever been discovered. The Yoruba civilization flourished for many years, but it became a main target for slave traders, and its vitality was gradually undermined. On the African side, the city of Oyo, in about 1600, took the lead in undermining the other city-states and selling the captives to the Europeans. From the 18th century, the Dahomey Empire to the west continued the onslaught. Yoruba influence in the region gradually took a backseat to the newly rising power of Benin. This civilization, in some ways a child of the Yoruba, became dominant by the 15th century, where we take up the story. Great Benin. From the 15th century onwards, West Africa began to face the rigors of the slave trade. The threat initially came from the Portuguese. Later, it came from other Europeans. A few states survived this period, though in some of these, the leaderships failed to act decisively against the enslavers. A Portuguese ambassador could, however, record that 20 leagues from the coast there lives a monarch to whom his subjects show the same reverence as Catholics do to the Pope. When foreign ambassadors come into his presence, they are never afforded a glimpse of his face. A curtain hides him from their sight. He only sticks out his foot, and they may kiss it when taking their departure. Great Benin, also known as Edo, was an important state that flourished in the southern Nigeria. In the 15th century, it was an empire distinguished by the sumptuousness and comfort of its capital, Benin City, and by the refinement of the royal art. Oba, i.e. King, Iweri the Great, founder of the empire, reigned between 1440 and 1473. Noted as a brilliant ruler, he is remembered for strong leadership and military prowess. Marching against 201 towns and villages over the southern Nigeria region, he captured their leaders and compelled the masses to pay tribute. Among the subdued regions were Ika, Ikiti, Ikare, Kukuruku, and the Igbo territories west of the Niger River. An able politician, he used religious authority and intimidation as well as constitutional reforms to strengthen his hand. These strategies fortified the Obaship against the power of overambitious ministers. The early history of Benin was much more modest period associated with the Ogiso dynasty. Igodo, first of its 15 rulers, lived around 900 AD and enjoyed a long reign. Ogiso heir, his son, a successor, founded many villages such as Irua and Ego. He was a patron of craftsmen, and more significantly, he founded institutions. The guilds of weavers, carvers, and potters date back to his time. These craftsmen worked clay, wood, and leather. Moreover, Ere established royal emblems and the ceremonies that accompanied them, which continued into later times. These include the throne, the stool, ritual swords, the fan, the anklets, the collars, and the crown. Ogiso Ororo, the 8th ruler, is remembered as an evil queen who was assassinated in consequence of her tyranny. Ogiso Henenden, the 12th ruler, presided over a period of prosperity. The village of Banan grew in population as a result. Finally, Uwodu was the last ruler of the Ogiso dynasty. An ineffectual ruler, he was later banished for incompetence. He is primarily remembered as someone who never convened a meeting except in times of trouble or crisis. After his expulsion, 2 administrators, Evian and Ogimiv, ruled in the interim. The Republican period, however, proved to be short-lived. Evian attempted to install his son as the next Oba, but the people revolted, sending ambassadors to the Yoruba capital of Ife. The tradition goes they begged for a ruler. The Yorubas responded and sent Prince Oranminyan to Benin. The prince founded the second dynasty in 1170 AD, after overcoming Ogamiv's resistance. Oranminyan resided at a high-walled palace built for him at Usama. Concerning this monument, Professor Bleer, an art historian, informs us that the construction of this building was considered so important that its creation has been ritually reenacted at each royal enthronement. Stride and Ifka, authors of the well-respected People and Empires of West Africa, placed the Oranminyan story in proper historical perspective. The main point about the Oranminyan legend is that it links Benin to Yoruba land, emphasizing the influence of Yoruba methods of government on the Benin institutions. Indeed, tradition distinguishes most firmly between the Ogiso dynasty, which is apparently peculiar to Edo of Benin, and the second dynasty, which shows marked Yoruba influences. Accompanying the Yoruba dynastic connection came the importation of state swords into Benin, stables of horses for ceremonial occasions, and later a guild of royal brass casters. A curious royal burial practice developed that reinforced this cultural link. When a king of Benin died, it became customary to send his head or other symbolic parts to Ife for a royal burial. A Yoruba artist was then commissioned to make a metal portrait of the head. The portrait was returned to Benin, where it was placed on an altar. This practice continued until the time of Oba Ugola in the late 13th century. This king requested of the Oni of Ife that he might send a sculptor to Benin to teach Yoruba metallurgical art among the Beni. Complying with the request, the Oni of Ife sent Igwa Huga, a master sculptor, to Benin. Igwa Huga founded the Benin Guild of Bronzesmiths. Incidentally, to this day, there are shrines dedicated to him in Benin City. Developments in statecraft are associated with Oba Iweka I, Oranminyan's son and successor. Ascending the throne in 1200 AD, he reformed the government by introducing the Uzama Nihinran. They were a body of 7 counselors of state, considered in some respects successors to the Ogiso dynasty. The 7 title positions were hereditary. As kingmakers, they ensured that each new Oba was installed according to the precedent. The most senior of these counselors presented the crown to the Oba at each new coronation. Considered guardians of tradition, they had rights similar to that of the royalty. They had rights to have their own palaces and also their own priests. Iwido succeeded Iweka I in 1255. His ascension to the throne was far from smooth, however. A military challenge came from yet another Ogibmive, an ambitious noble. Iwido's army triumphed, however. The victorious Iwido built a palace inside Benin City that became the new royal residence. Usama continued to maintain importance. Each new Oba was installed at a ceremony there to commemorate Iwido's defeat of Agameve. The king asserted religious authority as well as the political. He appointed a chief priest to supervise public rituals and to strengthen his role as a divine king. The chief priest's responsibility was to establish earth cult shrines. Other reforms involved creating new title holders and thus increasing the size of the bureaucracy. Finally, he passed good laws and commissioned the building of a prison. This institution continued to be in use right up until 1897. Chief Egaharveba, the distinguished Benin historian, recorded that he was one of our greatest and most prudent Obas. Oba Uwere of the 15th century ushered in another great wave of constitutional reforms. Like Iwedo before him, he used religious intimidation to buttress his authority as a sacred figure. Moreover, he appointed a new tier of bureaucrats, creating a strongly centralized system to administer his empire. These bureaucrats, the town chiefs, were appointed to undermine the control of the hereditary palace chiefs. One of the town chiefs headed the newly created standing army. Modern historians give different and conflicting explanations of how this worked, but Stride and Ifka explain it thus. Benin was apparently governed by the Oba, the Uzama, and the palace chiefs. The palace chiefs were divided into 3 associations of title holders: the chamberlains, household officials, and the harem keepers. Palace chiefs both inherited and achieved their titles by paying fees to their association. What Uwere found was that the palace chiefs were too powerful. To strengthen the Obaship, Uwere introduced another association of chiefs, the town chiefs. They generally obtained their title on appointment by the Oba. Only one title was hereditary. Uwere appointed 4 town chiefs to increase his authority against the palace officials. Later, their number was much enlarged by Uwere's successors. Town chiefs played an important part in the government, and the senior town chief, the Ishere, became the commander-in-chief of the army. They sat with the palace chiefs and the Uzama on the state council, which Uwere was said to have set up. The Benin army contained divisions of knights that wore body armor. Dr. Diop analyzed Benin bronze art and noted that the appearance and bronzes of knights arrayed in all manner of cuirasses, armored from head to toe, seems to prove that the metallurgy was put to all kinds of uses, for all of his armor was, without a doubt, of local manufacture. Benin City began as an unwalled village. The first population expansion turning the village into a town began during the time of Ogiso Hinenden in around 1000 AD. Oba Ogula raised the first walls in 1283. For security reasons, he also had moats dug around the outskirts of the town and at other important towns and villages. Oba Iwere raised new walls in 1460, building the great innermost walls and other ditches. Inside the city, he had good roads built, such as Utantan Street and Akpavpava Street. Indeed, during his career, the city achieved great fame and importance. It had a walled and moated inner city of 9 gates called Ogbi. This part contained the Ogisa dynasty and Second Dynasty palaces. Also, there were the houses of the functionaries and the wards for the guilds. There were guilds of ivory carvers, iron and brass smiths, weavers and embroiderers, and finally drummers and sculptors. The Second Dynasty Palace was located in the center of the city at the terminus of 3 great avenues. Its central location and orientation reflected the temporal and cosmological power of the Oba. Surrounding the area was the Ore Nukua, the outer city. Also walled, it contained the compounds of residence previously associated with the Ogiso dynasty. The Queen Mother and Crown Prince had their own palaces located outside both sets of the walls. Uwere popularized the impluvium architecture style of the Yorubas, creating for the first time in Benin a centrally planned metropolis built on a horizontal vertical grid. Mr. Garlake suggested that the construction work of the walls and ditches were on a scale comparable to the Great Wall of China. Professors Oliver and Atmore, in a new work, add that Excavation has shown that the main city walls are but the nucleus of a vast system of defense walling totaling perhaps 10,000 miles in all, which suggests that the city grew by encompassing a number of small, closely neighboring towns, reflecting a growth in population around a successful industrial center. Even before the full extent of the city walling had become apparent, the Guinness Book of Records carried an entry in 1974 edition that read as follows. The largest earthworks in the world carried out prior to the mechanical era were the linear earth boundaries of the Benin Empire, i.e. Benin City, in the midwestern state of Nigeria. They were first reported by modern European scholars in 1903 and partially surveyed in 1967. In April 1973, it was estimated by Mr. Patrick Darling, and the total length of earthworks was probably between 5,000 and 8,000 miles. 8,000 to 12,800 kilometers, with the total amount of earth estimated at 500 to 600 million yards, 380 to 46 million meters. Arts and crafts have always played an important role in this society. Heir of the 10th century, patronized carvers and carpenters. In addition, he founded their guilds, later to become important institutions. The carvers produced goods of wood and ivory. Heir is also credited with introducing the use of wooden bowls and plates together with mortars and pestles. During the Ogiso period, terracotta heads were made that surrounded the altars of the kings. There were also early manufacturers in brass. Craftsmen made bracelets and bells. Over 3 centuries later, we hear of Oba Ogula sending for a Yoruba artist to teach Yoruba-style metal art among the Beninese. Igwegwa, the Yoruba sculptor, founded the Benin Guild of Bronzesmiths. Later still, Iwere, the great Oba of the 15th century, was a patron of ivory carving. Later still, arts and crafts would continue to develop. Oba Ozula, a successor of Iwere the Great, in 1481, was another fine soldier who widened the boundaries of the empire. His campaign saw Benin influence spread as far as the neighboring kingdoms of Akiti and Ijibu. In 1485 or 6, he received an ambassador from Portugal, Afonso de Aveiro. Before long, diplomatic and commercial links between the two countries were forged. A Portuguese chronicler recorded that Ozula sent a priest and ambassador to Portugal because he desired to learn more about these lands, the arrival of the people from them in his country being regarded as unusual novelty. Ohen Okun, a man of good speech and natural wisdom, returned home laden with presents for himself, his wife, and the Oba, all sent by the Portuguese. To facilitate trade between the two countries, the priest established a trading factory at Ughoten. In an earlier period, Benin's trade links were with the Saharan states to the north. They exported ivory, pepper, and cotton goods in exchange for Saharan copper and Sudanese horses. Oba Odugebedo, 1299 to 1334, an industrious ruler, presided over a noteworthy period of agriculture expansion. Once trade links had been made with Portugal and elsewhere in Europe, they exported dyed cotton cloth, wool, jasper, leopard skins, soap, and later palm oil. This was in addition to ivory and pepper. Some of the ivory had been beautifully and aesthetically carved into common sets and tableware that graced none but the highest tables. To this day, art historians marvel at their refined and exquisite beauty that also combines practical use. Werner Gillen, author of A Short History of African Art, informs us that these objects depicted knights, sometimes on horseback, Portuguese coats of arms, and Christian iconography. Apart from the many carvings made for Portuguese royalty and nobility, there were those acquired possibly also through the Portuguese by Medici, who were the most avid collectors of these works. Among other royal collectors was Augustus, Duke of Saxonia, one of whose acquisitions in 1590 was recorded in 1595 by the Kunstkammer of Dresden. The Museum für Völkerkunde in Vienna has ivory spoons and a fork from the collection of the Castle of Ambras in Tyrol, started by Archduke Ferdinand in the second half of the 16th century. The trade in soap is of a particular interest since we are informed that By the 17th century, the production of soap was on such a scale that Portugal banned imports of West African soap in order to protect its own soap boiling industry. Oba Isigi ascended the throne in 1504 and had a long and eventful reign of perhaps 46 years. He introduced a special post in the administration for his mother called Ioba, the Queen Mother. A Dutch chronicler would report a century later that the Oba undertakes nothing of importance without having sought her counsel. The art of the time reflects this reality. Isigi commissioned a highly improved metal art that has since achieved worldwide distinction. Of the best-known pieces are the famous Queen Mother Idea busts. Professor Felix von Luschen, a former official of the Berlin Museum für Volkskunde, stated that these works from Benin are equal to the very finest examples of European casting technique. Benvenuto Cellini could not have cast them better, nor could anyone else before or after him. Technically, these bronzes represent the very highest possible achievement. Afonso de Aveiro and other Portuguese agents returned to Benin. They aroused Isigi's interest in the possibility of acquiring firearms from Portugal for future campaigns. There was, however, a catch. Manuel, the Portuguese king, wrote Isigi, explaining to him that, "When we see that you have embraced the teachings of Christianity like a good and faithful Christian, there will be nothing within our realms which we shall not be glad to favor you. Whether it be arms or cannon and all other weapons of war for use against your enemies, of such things we have a great store. As your ambassador, Dom Jorge, will inform you." It was not to be. In 1516, and without Portuguese arms, Isigi scored a crushing defeat on Igala to the north. They had attempted an invasion that posed a threat to the very existence of Benin. Isigi compelled the defeated Igala to pay reparations. The Portuguese king did, however, send missionaries to Benin who successfully converted the Oba son to the Christian faith. Bini Christians also established a few churches in the Benin city at Obleka, Edomweri, and Akpapava. The last church became the Holy Cross Cathedral. Christianity, however, remained distinctly a minority religion, largely restricted to a few members of the court. It seems that the indigenous religion was just too well organized to be undermined by this foreign threat. By the latter half of the 16th century, the ancient village of Ugohouten became transformed into the seaport of Guado. The Oba imposed a series of tolls and customs on goods that passed through here, some of which came via the Hassas from the Saharan trade. Benin prospered greatly. The markets were typically held in large public squares every 3 or 4 days. Dr. An anonymous Dutch source tells us that these markets and traffickings are held and arranged in a very orderly manner. The currency was cowrie shells. On sale when James Welsh visited there 1588 was soap that smelleth like beaten violets, ivory spoons, very curiously wrought with divers portions of fowls and beasts made upon them, cotton and woolen cloths, very curiously woven, bark cloth, pepper, ivory, palm oil, and mats that were pretty and fine. Incidentally, Welsh presented the Oba with the gift of a telescope. Also for sale on a typical market day were foodstuffs such as fowls, dogs, monkeys, catfish, dried lizards, beans, fruit, and vegetables. Other goods included dishes, drinking cups, and ironwork products. The iron products were fishing and agricultural tools, such as hoes. A variety of cloths were on sale. Dr. Ulfert Dapper, a Dutch geographer, listed Dutch textiles and other goods that were on sale in Benin, including gold and silver cloth, linen, red velvet, fine cotton stuffs, woolen stuffs, and Harlem stuffs with flower designs. Other Dutch goods included jugs, bangles, beads, red glass earrings, gilt-looking glasses, and crystal. One trading product that the Bini had access to but refused to exploit was gold mining. Landolph, an 18th century French writer, explained that no one is allowed to touch them under pain of death for fear lest Europeans in their avarice bring fire and sword as they did into Peru. The empire achieved its maximum expansion in the 16th century, ruling Ishan to the north, Isoko and Yorhobo of the lower Niger Delta, southern Yoruba territories, and western Igbo land, Administering this territory were 3 tiers of imperial government. At the top was the Oba, an increasingly austere and sacred figure. Then came the State Council of Benin City. Beneath these were the tributary units. The units consisted of an overlord, royally appointed, who headed the unit. The overlord appointed a servant and his representative. Finally, there were the people of the village, town, or dependency. Tradition dictated that the overlord lived in Benin City. His role was to transmit the interests of the constitutions to the Oba. In addition, he had to organize the yearly or twice-yearly collection of tribute in the form of yams, palm oil, meat, livestock, and foodstuffs to be sent to the Oba's court. Tradition further dictated that the servant would live in the village, town, or dependency to represent the overlord there. In the early 1600s, other envoys from Europe visited Benin. Some of these left eye-catching descriptions of what they saw. Samuel Blomer, a man who lived in Africa for several years, is one of such example. In 1668, Dutch scholar Dr. Olfert Dapper paraphrased his rich and full account in a famous book entitled Description of Africa. It is so engrossing that we have taken the liberty of reproducing portions from it to describe the splendor of Benin City. The town, comprising the Queen's Court, is about 5 or 6 miles in circumference. It is protected at one side by a wall 10 feet high, made of double stockades of big trees tied to each other by cross beams fastened crosswise, and stuffed up with the red clay, solidly put together. This wall only surrounds the town on one side. The town possesses several gates, 8 or 9 feet in height and 5 in width, with doors made of whole pieces of wood, hanging or turning on a peg, like the peasants' fences here in this country, i.e. Holland. The King's Court is square, and stands at the right-hand side when entering the town by a gate of Gaten, i.e. Guato, and is certainly as large as the town of Haarlem in Holland, and entirely surrounded by a special wall, like that which encircles the town. It is divided into many magnificent palaces, houses, apartments of the courtiers, and comprises beautiful and long square galleries, about as large as the Exchange of Amsterdam, but one larger than another, resting on wooden pillars from top to bottom covered with cast copper, on which are engraved the pictures of their war exploits and battles, and are kept very clean. Most palaces and the houses of the king are covered in palm leaves instead of square pieces of wood, and every roof is decorated with a small turret ending in a point, on which birds are standing. Birds cast in copper with outstretched wings, cleverly made after living models. The town has 30 very straight and broad streets. Every one of them are about 120 feet wide, from which branch out many side streets. This indicates a planned city built on an enormous scale, structured on a horizontal vertical grid. In color, the buildings were terracotta red. Dapper compared the Exchange in Amsterdam with the palaces of the courtiers, owing to the fact that it was the largest building in Holland. The houses are built alongside the street in good order, continues Dapper, the one close to another, adorned with gables and steps and roofs made of palm or banana leaves or leaves from other trees. They are usually broad with long galleries inside, especially so is the case of the houses of nobility, and divided into many rooms which are separated by walls made of red clay, very well erected, and they can make and keep them as shiny and smooth by washing and rubbing as any wall in Holland can be made with chalk, and they are like mirrors. The upper stories are made of the same sort of clay. Moreover, every house is provided with a well for supply of fresh water. Benin's later history of the 18th and 19th centuries, however, show stagnation rather than cultural advance. The port of Guado silted up, leading to the merchants going elsewhere to trade. There were no great obas after Orhogbuya, 1550-1578. Furthermore, the weakness of an over-centralized government began to show itself in poor local representation and growing administrative corruption. Even its metal art began to show a stiffness of concept and execution, although the wood and ivory guild workers maintained an extremely high artistic and technical standard right to the end. Benin history continued until 1897. In that year, the British Army invaded and plundered the country, exiling the Oba. The conquerors stole thousands of priceless artifacts that are still held by London institutions and private collections. Following this outrage, they burned the city. There are, however, descriptions by British writers that are worthy of discussion. Captain Richard Burton visited the Nigeria region in 1862. He was most puzzled by the architecture he witnessed because it is impossible not to think that the Yoruba in ancient times derived its architecture through the Romans, whose conquests in northern Africa were as extensive as in north of Europe. We find in every house a Tuscan atrium with a catavium or gangway running around the rectangular impluvium. The tank or piscine, which catches the rain and drippings falling through the compluvium or central opening in the roof. Sometimes the atrium is a tetrastyle in which pillars at the four corners of the impluvium supports girders or main beams of the roof. Burton further informs us that the royal palace is supposed to contain not less than 15,000 souls. This data corroborates both Blomert, who suggested that the palace was the same size as the Dutch city of Haarlem, and another traveler called Utzheimer. Writing in 1603, Joshua Utzheimer suggested that the royal palace was about the size of the German city of Tübingen. Burton was not alone in alleging Roman affinities in Benin architecture. Dr. F. N. Roth, writing in 1890s, gave the following description of Benin House. The house or compound is about 60 by 25 feet. It is furnished with a pent roof all around. The roof is supported by heavy rafters, etc., much resembling the oak roofings of old houses in England. The rafters are carved, but most of them are covered with figured brass sheetings, which are so characteristic of the king's buildings and are kept polished. The soil is banked up all around the walls to the height of about 18 inches. This embankment gives the center of the house the look of a hollow, after the manner of the old Roman villas. Writing at the same time, Mr. Cyril Punch noted that there was usually an entrance court giving onto the street by a big door. There were two recesses. In one were arranged the lares and penetes, and the father of the household celebrated yearly ancestral rites in memory of his father. Through other recesses by a door, entrance was gained to the first patio or reception room. The thatch sloped down to the center and drained into the cistern, exactly as one sees in houses of Pompeii. The drains were made very ingeniously. These days, scholars no longer claim Roman influence on Benin or Yoruba architecture. However, the fact that Benin City was compared to the Roman city of Pompeii does prove that they were comparable. This indicates the high standard of Benin architecture and shows that it was every bit as impressive as its art. Congo. As with Great Benin, much of our information on Congo comes from reports and travelogues of European writers from the period. Professor Leo Frobenius, the pioneering German Africanist of the earlier 20th century, wrote a splendid summary of what the earlier travelers saw 500 years ago. When they arrived in the Gulf of the Guinea and landed at Veda in West Africa, the captains were astonished to find streets well laid out, bordered on either side for several leagues by 2 rows of trees. For days they traveled through a country of magnificent fields, inhabited by men clad richly colored garments of their own weaving. Further south in the Kingdom of the Congo, a swarming crowd dressed in silk and velvet, great states were well ordered and down to the most minute details. Powerful rulers, flourishing industries, civilized to the marrow of their bones, and the condition of the countries on the eastern coast. Mozambique, for example, was quite the same. One such report is the justly famous History of Kingdom of Congo by slave trader Duarte Lopez and recorded by Filippo Pigfetta. Originally published in 1591, it has served as a basis of reconstructing Congolese history. It is one of the many useful Portuguese documents on Congo history. The Kingdom of Congo was a flourishing state in the 15th century. It was situated in a region of northern Angola and western Congo. Its population was conservatively estimated at 2 or 3 million people. The country was divided into 6 administrative provinces and a number of dependencies. The provinces were Mbamba, Mbata, Pango, Mpemba, Nsundi, and Soya. The dependencies included Matari, Wando, Wembo, and the province of Ambundu. All in turn were subject to authority of the Mani Congo king. The capital of the country, Mbaza Congo, was the Pemba province. From the province of Mbamba, the military stronghold, it was possible to put 400,000 soldiers into the field. The early history of the country is obscure, but is believed to have been a vast empire in more exalted days. The Mani Congo, in the 16th century, still held regal titles that alluded to these vanished glories. The Mani Congo once ruled Congo, Loango, see page 47, Kikongo, Ngoyo, the Tsare River region, the Ambundu, Angola, Aquisma, Musuru, Matamba, Mulilu, Musuku, Anziko, Pongo, Alumbu, and other territories. The region covered stretches as far as modern Gabon and as far south into Angola. In other words, the empire covered a vast region of 300,000 square kilometers. It is debatable whether one single law dominated the entire region. It is clear, however, that a single civilization predominated. The Kikongo language is spoken the length of the coast as far north as Ogooué, from Stanley Pool to the ocean. In the interior, it is spoken as far as the territory of the Batike. Also, it is spoken as far east as the Kwango River. Throughout this large region are similar social structures, customs, and religious beliefs. By the late 1st and early 2nd millennium period, there is evidence from the region of copper mining and manufacture, ironsmithing, ivory trading, and cloth manufacture, including bark and raffia textiles. The smallest political unit was the village, typically characterized by matrilineage. The head of each village seems to have been hereditary. Above the village level were the districts, headed either by royally appointed officials or by provincial governors. They performed administrative duties and served as judges. All title holders bore the title of Mani, i.e. Lord, followed by the name of their province, district, or their function. The government derived its income from taxation and labor. Tribute was paid in raffia cloth, ivory, hides, slaves, and tolls. Brightly colored Nzimbu shells were the currency. These came from the island of Luanda and were typically mined and graded into size by women. Size dictated the relative value of each shell. Government income was used to grant gifts to the title holders at court and also to the territorial rulers. The courts, royal and provincial, had officials, pages, musicians, and soldiers. The taxes were paid once yearly at a ceremony in front of the king's palace. All territorial officials would come and bring their produce from their locality. They would also renew their oath of loyalty to the Mani Congo. At this point, the king could remove incompetent officials if he so decided. In 1482, reports reached Nzinga Akuwu, possibly the 13th Mani Congo, that whales of a peculiar type have been spotted from the coast. These whales are thought to have been the boats of the Portuguese sailors under the leadership of Diogo Cao. This marked their entry into Congolese history. The Portuguese sailors returned in 1485, and envoys were exchanged between the two countries. The Portuguese left 4 Christian missionaries at the Congo court, while 4 Mpinda nobles accompanied Diogo Cao on his return voyage to Portugal. According to Herbert Wendt, the Mpinda nobles were well treated in Portugal, where they were taught Portuguese and laden with presents. They were also thoroughly questioned about their homeland. On the other hand, in the midst of the primeval forest, the Portuguese missionaries in Congo experienced a well-organized political system with taxes and rates. There was a brilliant court and a great civil service. The state constructed roads, imposed tolls, supported a large army, and had a monetary system of shells, of which the Mani Congo had a monopoly. The Congo Kingdom even had a few satellite states, for example, the state of Nagola, i.e. Ndongo, in present-day Angola. The original kingdom was about the size of France and Germany put together. In April 1491, on Cao's return, The Mani Soul was baptized as a Christian by the Portuguese missionaries. Taking the Portuguese name Dom Manuel, he had a church built in his province. Months later, the Mani Congo received the Portuguese Mbanza Congo, laying on a celebration of music and dance for them. At this display, the Congo nobles carried ironwood swords and shields. The lower orders carried bows and arrows. The king himself was seated on a throne inlaid with ivory raised on a platform. Trumpeters with instruments of ivory repeated their composition 12 times to represent the 12 generations of kings since the founding of the Congo Kingdom. During this meeting, the Mani Congo converted to Christianity, taking the name Dom Yoa the First. Mr. Alan Schlofield, author of Dark Kingdoms, suggests that it was only then the Portuguese learned the real reason for the quick conversion. The kingdom was on the point of civil war. Several peoples were rebelling against the central power of the Mani Congo, was about to help his son Afonso put down the revolt. Naturally, he wanted Portuguese aid. One must try to imagine the Portuguese at this moment. There were not many of them by comparison with their black hosts. They had come to this remote place to proselytize and begin a trading organization, and within a few weeks of their arrival, they were being asked to take part in a war which did not concern them in the least. But the request came from a brother in Christ, and it was not possible to refuse. So a black army marched out onto the Central African field of battle under the banner of the cross, accompanied by a number of white mercenaries carrying muskets. It is hardly surprising that they won the day and returned to the capital in triumph. In gratitude, the Mani Congo settled the Portuguese in one section of the town not too far from his own palace, and the two races lived in such amity that doors, it said, were never closed and there was no need for guards. The coexistence had begun. Dr. Chancellor Williams, the noted African-American social scientist, interprets the Christianization of the Congo as a cynical plot by the Portuguese to Europeanize the country. For example, Congolese kings and nobles received European names on being baptized. They had their children educated in Portugal. They paid allegiance to the Roman Pope. Jesuits became counselors to their royals, and a whole new class of people with European titles appeared, such as dukes and infantes. By 1512, the Portuguese Regimento appeared, issued by their king, Manuel. It contained an outline for their Congolese policy. The document begins with an assertion that all Catholic kings are brothers. It therefore follows that Manuel will help his brother, the King of Congo, build Christianity in the kingdom. Moreover, the Portuguese ambassador is to act as an advisor to the Congolese king in reforming the Congo court along Christian lines. In particular, the Congolese should receive European titles, carry European emblems, and adopt Portuguese courtly etiquette. In addition, the Congolese should pay for the Christianization program by exporting copper, ivory, and slaves to Portugal. Finally, the ambassador should find out all that he could about the politics and geography of the Congo. Dr. Williams wrote an incisive analysis of the document. This is one of the most interesting and significant documents in history of black people because it was the first detailed blueprint for the conquest of the black man's mind. Acculturation via Christianity, his body, slavery, and his country. The historic document, however, was couched in all the endearing words and phraseology of equality and brotherly love. Despite these negative undercurrents, the Portuguese sources give a bright picture of Congo life. From them, we learn that the capital city, San Salvador, i.e. Mbanza, Congo, was advantageously situated on the highest mountain in the country. This offered a natural defense and gave a panoramic view of the kingdom. Pigafetta gave its population as over 100,000 people. The king, Dom Yoa, i.e. Nzinga Akuu, raised thick walls, 1 mile in circumference around his palace and the royal houses. An area of similar size was reserved for the Portuguese and was also walled. The doors of the aristocratic homes faced the walls of the church, as did the homes of the Portuguese. Outside of the enclosure stood numerous buildings that belonged to the various lords. Apparently, it was not possible to determine the size of the town because of all the countryside was filled with palaces and royal houses. The habitation of each lord was a walled village. Another source adds that the royal enclosure had several gates guarded by soldiers and trumpeters. One source gives the population of Mambanza Soo, the capital of Soyo province, as 30,000 people. An abundance and variety of agricultural products were grown in Congo. There were crops of bananas, cauliflower, coconuts, cola, citrus fruits, cucumber, palms of various varieties, including the date palms, pineapples, plantains, rice, watermelons, yams, and many others. Other grains were imported from Egypt by an overland route. In addition, other agricultural produce of American origin were imported via the Portuguese. Built on their agricultural industries, the Congolese produced oil, wine, vinegar, and bread. From wild palms, they made mats, baskets, and other articles of everyday use. Furthermore, their houses were typically made of tightly interlaced palm branches, divided into convenient rooms, and were thatched. The impression conveyed by these buildings was more akin to that of the weaving or basket making than of building in the traditional sense. The Kikongo word tunga means to build and to weave. Ornamental wooden palisades surrounded these habitations. Mats covered the floors. The most revered profession in Congo was that of the ironsmith. They typically forged knives, weapons, axes, and hoes. Moreover, they forged copper products and made bracelets using the celebrated lost wax technique. Jorges Balandier, author of the scholarly Daily Life in the Kingdom of the Congo, made the following comment on the state of Congo metallurgy. There is no doubting the existence of an expert metallurgical art in the ancient Congo. Only the competition of objects from abroad and the slow deterioration brought about its decline. A further proof is provided by recent ethnographic documents. The Bakongo were aware of the toxicity of lead vapors. They devised preventative and curative methods, both pharmacological, massive doses of pawpaw and palm oil, and mechanical, exerting a pressure to free the digestive tract. For combating lead poisoning, technology and rational knowledge tried to keep in step. The European writers of the period, Pigafetta, Dapper, and Ogilvy, inform us of the delicate crafts of the peoples living in the eastern Congo and adjacent regions. They manufactured various textiles including damasks, sarcenets, satins, taffeta, cloth of tissue and velvet, cut and uncut. They made the yarn from the leaves of palm trees from which threads of extreme fineness and evenness were drawn. The product were light and waterproof. Professor de Graaf Johnson made the curious observation that their brocades, both high and low, were far more valuable than the Italian. For comparison, we note that the Italian brocade gained an important reputation in the 15th century. One reliable source informs us that during the century, leading Florentine merchants readily spent as much on the single outfit as on large townhouse. A set of brocade walls hanging could cost more than a country estate. Although referring to an earlier century, this places the Congolese textiles within a context. Some of the Congo treasures are still to be found in European museums. Professor Frobenius highlighted the importance of these collections. And what they told, says Frobenius, those old captains, those chiefs of expeditions, the Delelbes, the Desmarches, the Pigafettas, and all others, what they told is true. It can be verified. In the old Royal Kunstkammer of Dresden, in the Weidmann collection of Ulm, in many another European curiosity cabinets, one still finds collections of objects from West Africa dating from the epoch. Wonderful plush velvets of an extreme softness made from the tenderest leaves of a certain banana tree, stuffs soft and pliant, brilliant and delicate as silks, woven with well-prepared raffia fiber, ceremonial javelins, their blades to the very points inlaid with the finest copper, bows so graceful and ornamented so beautifully that they would do honor to any museum of arms whatsoever, calabashes decorated with the most perfect taste, sculpture in ivory and wood, the workmanship of which reveals skill and style. Dom Yoa I died in 1506. His loyalty to the religion of Portuguese, however, seems to have been merely opportunistic. Mr. Schofield narrates that He had in many ways been a disappointment to the Portuguese. Quite soon after he had been baptized, it became clear that he had become a Christian for reasons of state and that he had returned to tradition. Traditional elements among the black nobility had never been happy about his baptism and spoke darkly of ancestors betrayed, of sorcery and vengeance. But what had hastened John's, i.e. Yoa's, apostasy was the uncompromising attitude of the Portuguese towards his marriages. They saw them as unchristian and tried to bring pressure on him to reject all his wives save one. What they did not realize was that the Mani Congo took on wives for precisely the same diplomatic reasons as the European royalty. They represented power blocks. By many careful marriages, the Mani Congo was able to make his position virtually unassailable. When the Portuguese remained intractably moral, the Mani Congo reacted. He rejected the religion. About 1495, most of the missionaries, and with them the black nobles who had been converted, were obliged to leave the city of Congo. Dom Afonso I, a Christianized son, succeeded him. He was, however, met with vigorous opposition from his non-Christian brother, Mpanzu Kitama. Prince Mpanzu occupied the capital with the support of the Mani Kabonga, the traditional priests, and forces of nearly 200,000 men. They viewed the Christian influence as a threat to their power. Afonso, however, triumphed over Mpanzu in battle in spite of the fact that he had inferior numbers of perhaps 10,000 soldiers and 100 Christians, both Congolese and Portuguese. Afonso attributed his victory to a religious miracle and thus strengthened his desire to spread Christianity in the land. After the battle, Afonso executed his brother but converted the Mani Kabonga. He gave the latter the position of keeper of the holy water. Years later, he built the Church of the Holy Cross to commemorate the miracle. Afonso I wrote the King Manuel of Portugal, requesting that he send priests and technicians to spread Christianity further. Within 3 years, schools were established in which students were instructed in Portuguese and Christianity. Furthermore, Afonso increased the flow of Congo students to Portugal, and he himself studied Portuguese laws. The Portuguese sent him a collection of these in 5 great volumes. His aim seems to have been the creation of a Renaissance-style Christian state as then existed in Europe. His achievements went beyond this, however. Dr. Hiret reports that a local body of scribes was trained, able eventually to communicate in written Latin, Portuguese, and Kikongo. By 1516, one source reports that the capital had 1,000 students studying grammar, humanities, and things of faith. There were also schools for girls directed by the sister of the king. Finally, Afonso built churches. As well as the Church of the Holy Cross built in 1517, he built the Church of Our Lady of the Victories in 1526. By those close of the century, the capital had 6 churches. The relationship between Congo and Portugal, however, eventually soured. In 1508, the first slaves from Congo were sent as presents to King Manuel to pay for the Christianization program. The Portuguese workers sent to the Congo in return failed to deliver on the work that was agreed. In addition, their shabby and arrogant conduct was a cause for concern. Nor was it long before their enslaving activities and abuses of the Congolese women got out of hand. Dr. Williams wrote, "The Portuguese Christianization of the Congo created something more than chaos. It was a revolting mess, no matter from what angle it was viewed. To begin with, priests were not only among the leading slave traders, but they also owned slave ships to carry the black cargoes to distant lands. Priests also had their harems of black girls, some having as many as 20 each. One of the main attractions that drew thousands of white men was their unlimited sexual freedom with all the black girls and women who were enslaved and helpless in power of their masters. These wholesale raids on black womanhood continued to swell the mulatto population, the majority of which, as in this case of Egypt and the Sudan, became the faithful servants and loyal representatives of the conquering races to which their fathers belonged." These abuses prompted a series of letters from Afonso I to the Portuguese court. Mr. Schofield adds, more than 20 of Afonso's letters to the King Manuel and his successor, King John III, survive, and very bleak reading they make. One such letter was dated 6 June 1526. There are many traders in all corners of the country, wrote Afonso I. They bring ruin to the country. Every day people are enslaved and kidnapped, even nobles, even members of the king's own family. The pleas fell on deaf ears and enslaving continued. Moreover, Afonso sent a gift of silver to Portugal in the 1520s. This convinced the Portuguese that silver mines existed within Congo territory despite Afonso's assertions to the contrary. The Portuguese further believed that the Congo had an indigenous source of gold. These beliefs led Portugal to continue their actions in the region. Professor Jan Vencina, the highly important authority on Congo, comments that Afonso's reign set a pattern in Congo history for more than a century to come. The slave trade, the quest for mines, the Portuguese factions, and half-hearted efforts towards educating and converting the Congolese would continue practically unchanged until the 1640s. Yet Congo oral tradition sees Afonso as its greatest king. Dom Pedro I became the next ruler in 1545. Although supported by the local Portuguese, the people of the capital revolted and placed Diogo I on the throne in his place. Of Diogo, de Graaf Johnson says he was fond of valuable cloths of gold, tapestry, silk, and lordly furniture. A major crisis ensued in 1556, however. War broke out between slave-dealing factions supported by the vassal king of Ndongo to the south, against the Congolese king's forces. Both sides were aided and abetted by rival Portuguese parties. The Ndongo and the slave dealers triumphed and their country became independent of Congo overlordship. A second problem emerged for the Congo in 1569, during the reign of Dom Alvaro II, a successor. The Jaga, a semi-barbarian horde, invaded from lands to the east. They triggered a sudden and unprecedented collapse of social order in Congo. Moreover, they were slave traders. A famine and 6-year economic breakdown ensued. With the help of some of the Portuguese, Congo expelled this element. The Portuguese had other ideas, however. Beginning in 1575 and lasting for over a century, they launched a series of wars to capture Ndongo. Apparently, they thought the country contained silver mines. Congo made some sort of recovery during this period. It entered the 17th century with its institutions and most of its infrastructure intact. In addition, it developed a newly created messenger system using runners. Marathoners were established at different posts along the main communication routes to quickly relay the messages from the capital and court to the distant provinces. In Ndongo, however, things were not going terribly well. After 1608, the Portuguese army commander-in-chief instituted a new policy of repression. Bento Cardoso devised a system where every Ndongo notable would be owned by a Portuguese official and was responsible for delivering a certain quantity of slaves to the Portuguese. Should the Ndongo notable fail therein, he too would be enslaved. Over 100 notables were enslaved in a single year. Moreover, the Portuguese killed further 100. Even the ruler of Ndongo himself, a slave trader, resisted the aggression. War dragged on for years, but the Portuguese were forced to sue for peace. In 1622, Anne Nzinga, the Ndongo royal sister, attended a peace conference with the Portuguese convened in the coastal city of Luanda. She demanded 1. That the Portuguese evacuate Cabasa, the Ndongo capital. 2. That the Portuguese wage war on the Jaga. 3. All Ndongo notables who had become vassals of the Portuguese must return to their former loyalty to the Ndongo crown. In return, Nzinga promised to hand over Portuguese prisoners of war. The provisions of the treaty were designed to end all fighting in the region, but alas, the Portuguese breached this almost immediately by invading Congo. The following year, Anne Nzinga officially became the Ngola, which means king, and in this capacity made the regional alliances necessary to fight the Portuguese. She even made common cause with the Jaga. Ndongo was declared a free country the following year. All slaves entering the country were legally declared to be free. By 1629, her forces and allies captured Matamba, the neighboring state to the east. Incidentally, the state had a tradition of being ruled by females. This too was declared a free country. In 1641, Garcia II, a vigorous king, emerged in the Congo. He made alliances with the Dutch, see also page 349, to fight Portuguese aggression. His death in 1661 ended the great era of Congolese culture. In Ndongo, the death of Nzinga in 1663 marked a turning point. Her extraordinary and brilliant reign only delayed the inevitable. Towards the end of the 17th century, both Congo and the combined states of Ndongo and Matamba fell victim to European predator activities where executions, treachery, robbery, and violence became the order of the day. Before winding up this chapter, we note that one scholar, Professor W.E.B. Du Bois, described the West African coastal culture in language far more glowing than we have. We give him the final word. Of all the West African cultural development, our knowledge is fragmentary and incomplete, jumbled up with the African slave trade. Nearly all has disappeared in the frantic effort to paint Negroes as apes fit only for slavery and then to forget the whole discreditable episode. Wipe it out of history and emphasize the glory and philanthropy of Europe. Yet on the West Coast was perhaps the greatest attempt in human history before the 20th century to build a culture based on peace and beauty, to establish a communism of industry and of distribution of goods and services according to human need. It was crucified by greed, and its very memory blasphemed by the modern historical method. There can be no doubt but that the level of culture among the masses of Negroes in West Africa in the 15th century was higher than that of the Northern Europe, by any standard of measurement. Homes, clothes, artistic creation and appreciation, political organization, and religious consistency.